They told us the moon was dead. That was the first lie, and I held on to it longer than I should have, because a dead world is an easy thing to walk away from. You salvage what's worth pulling, you log the wreck, and you let the cold have the rest. Nobody mourns a place that was never alive to begin with. That was the whole trade. We came to that moon to strip a derelict freighter out of a glacier, and we believed the survey because believing it meant we'd be gone in a week. The hauler was called the Ardent, 20 years old, held together with weld scars and Soren's stubbornness. Soren had captained her since before I signed on, an old man with hands like dried leather, and a way of saying nothing that told you everything. Mara ran the engines and ran them better than they had any right to run. The kid, Pell, was 19 and thought he'd seen the galaxy because he'd been to 2 systems. There were others, but those are the 3 I carry. Those are the 3 I see when I close my eyes. The Pale hit us in the descent. I didn't know that name yet. I didn't know anything yet except that 1 second we were threading the upper atmosphere on a clean burn, and the next the Ardent's whole spine lit up white, and the alarms became one long scream, and Soren's voice came over the channel saying brace, just that brace, the last word I ever heard him say. We came down through cloud and then through nothing and then through ice. I remember the cold coming in before we'd even stopped moving, the hull peeling open like a tin, the snow rushing up through the breach to meet us. I woke alone in the cargo bay with blood frozen to the side of my head and the wind howling through a hole where the world used to be. I called for them. I called until my voice cracked and the cold took it. Then I went looking, and I found out why no one had answered. I won't put down what I found. A man my age has learned which things you say and which things you carry, and the crew of the Ardent is something I carry. I will only say that I was the one the math left over, the one who walks away. There is no dignity in it. It is just arithmetic, and I came out on the wrong side of mercy. I should have died in the first night. I want that understood, because everything after only makes sense if you know how close the end stood to me. The temperature out there dropped past anything a man survives. I built a shelter out of the wreck, sealed a compartment, bled a fuel cell for heat, and I sat in the dark of it listening to the moon try to come in and finish what the crash had started. I had maybe 9 days of power if I was careful. I had a hauler's emergency beacon screaming into the black on the off chance anyone was listening. I had a sidearm, a salvage cutter, a mag rifle Soren kept for the kind of ports where you needed one, and a body that hurt in places I didn't have names for. What I did not have was the truth about that moon. The survey said dead. The survey was wrong, or the survey was bought, or the survey was simply old. Because on the 3rd day, when I went out to scavenge what I could carry from the forward hold, I heard them. It came up through my boots before it reached my ears. A sound below sound, a pressure in the chest, the kind of low note you feel in your back teeth. I thought at first it was the ice settling, a glacier groaning under its own weight. Then it changed. It rose and fell in a way that no dead thing makes, a rhythm with grief in it, and I have heard grief. I knew it the way you know your own name, and I followed it because I was too tired and too hollowed out to be afraid. I came over a ridge of blue ice and looked down into a basin, and I saw them. There were perhaps 40 of them, long-bodied, longer than a transport, with hides the gray-white of old bone and wings folded tight against the cold like men holding their coats shut. They moved on 4 limbs with the wings as a 5th thing, and their throats glowed from within, a soft amber light that pulsed when they made that sound. They were not beasts. I want to be precise about this because everyone I have ever told gets it wrong. A beast does not gather its whole number in a circle. A beast does not lower its head in the same moment as the one beside it. A beast does not keen. They were arranged around a field of nests. I counted the nests later when I could bear to. 61. Shallow scrapes in the warmer ground where some vent kept the snow off, lined with shed scale and dried moss, each one big enough to hold a clutch, and every single one of them was empty, not abandoned, empty in the particular way that tells you something was taken. The lining was disturbed, the edges raked as if by claws that had clawed at nothing, and here and there the broken curve of a shell, pale as the things that came down from the sky. The largest of them stood at the center. Older than the rest, I think, her hide gone almost white, a long-healed gash down one flank. She had her head over a nest that still held a single unbroken egg, the last one, and she was not making the sound the others made. She was silent, and somehow that was worse. I have stood over graves. I know that silence. It is the silence of someone who has run out of the strength to weep and has only the standing left. I should have backed away. A sane man backs away from 40 grieving giants. But I had buried my crew that morning, what was left to bury, and I had screamed into the cold until I had nothing. And when I saw that white matriarch standing her vigil over the one egg she had left, something in me that the crash hadn't killed simply refused to leave. I knew, looking down into that basin, that whatever had emptied those nests was the same white fire that had emptied my ship. I knew it the way you know weather. We had been hit by the same hand. So I did the stupid thing. I came down into the basin with my hands open and empty. They saw me long before I reached the floor of it. The keening stopped. 40 heads turned and 40 throats brightened, and the air filled with a low, warning thrum that rattled the ice. The smaller ones spread their wings. I kept walking. I don't know why, except that running would have ended it faster and I was done running from things. I walked until I stood maybe 30 meters from the white one, close enough to see the membrane slide across her eye, close enough to smell them, a hot mineral smell like a struck match held under stone. She came toward me, the others held. She crossed the distance with a slowness that was its own kind of threat and lowered that vast pale head until her eye was level with mine, an eye the size of my chest, dark amber with a slit of black down the middle, and she looked at me. Not at me the way an animal looks, sizing up meat. She looked into me the way Sauron used to look at a man before he decided whether to trust him with the ship. I held still. I let her. I had nothing left to protect. Whatever she saw, she decided. She made a sound I'd never heard from the rest, short, soft, 2 notes falling, and she turned her head and breathed out, and the heat of it rolled over me like a furnace door swinging open. Then she walked back to her vigil and left me standing there alive, in the middle of a grief that wasn't mine and somehow was. That was how I met the Vesh. That's the closest my throat could come to the name they made for themselves, a long descending hum I never got right, so in my head they were the Vesh, and the white matriarch was Vesh herself, the mother of the whole Ridge clan. I lived with them for the rest of that long winter, and they kept me alive, and I learned what had been done to them. And in the end I taught them the only thing I had left to teach. I learned the Pale the way you learn a tide. The Vesh remembered them in their bodies, in the way the whole pack went silent and pressed low whenever the sky did a certain thing. I started watching the sky the way they did, and on the 11th day I saw why. They came down out of high cloud without sound, which was the first wrong thing about them. Everything that falls makes noise. The Pale fell silent. 3 landers, bone-white and many-jointed, shaped like nothing that should move, and they settled onto the far rim of the basin's reach on legs that flexed like an insect's. I lay flat in the snow beside a young Vesh who was shaking, and I watched the Pale go to work. They were not machines and they were not flesh. They were both and neither, pale exoskeletal things the size of men but wrong in their proportions. Too many joints, no faces, moving in a coordination so total it made my skin crawl. They poured out of the landers in lines and they swept the ground in a grid, methodical, patient, taking samples, taking soil, taking anything that lived and was small enough to carry. They found a nesting ground 2 ridges over, one I hadn't known about. And I watched through the rifle's optic as they lifted the eggs out one by one and stowed them in white cradles and carried them back to the landers. And the parents circled overhead screaming and could not come down, because the Pale had set up something on the ground, a pale lattice that hummed. And when one Vesh dove at it, the air around the lattice simply lit white, and the Vesh fell out of the sky smoking and did not get up. That was the cycle. That was the tithe. I pieced it together over the weeks from what I saw and what the Vesh showed me, because they did show me in their way, herding me to old nesting grounds gone cold, pressing my hand against the scorch marks. The Pale came on a schedule, a long one, a season's worth of days between visits, and each visit they took the soft biomass, the young, the eggs, anything that hadn't grown teeth and armor yet. They didn't take the adults. The adults were too costly to subdue and too tough to be worth the energy. So the Pale let them live and grieve and breed again, and came back, and took the next clutch, season after season, year after year, harvesting that moon the way a man harvests a field he intends to keep. And the Vesh could not stop them. I understood that completely once I'd seen the lattice. The adults were magnificent, they were strong. They could crack stone and throw a man across a basin with a wing, but they could not touch a thing that killed them from 100 meters out before they got close. They had tried. The scorch marks were where they had tried. The white scar on Vesh's flank was where she had tried once and survived to learn the lesson, so they had stopped trying. They had learned to lie flat and wait and bury their grief and breed again, because the only other choice was to die, and dying didn't save the eggs. That is the thing about the Pale I have never been able to make people feel. It was not cruelty. Cruelty would have been better, cleaner, something you could hate honestly. The Pale did not hate the Vesh. The Pale did not see the Vesh at all, not as anything that mattered. They didn't recognize the keening as grief. They didn't recognize the nests as anything but a yield. They had a model of that world, soil and biomass and extraction rates, and the Vesh were a line item in it, a renewable one, and you do not grieve a field and the field does not grieve you. They felt nothing because to them there was nothing there to feel. They took the children of a thinking, mourning, dignified people, and they felt about it exactly what a man feels turning over soil. That is what alien means, not tentacles, not teeth. It means a thing that can stand over your grief, and not even know it is grief. The deep winter closed over the basin not long after, and it is the deep winter, more than the tithe, that taught me what the Vesh were. My power was failing by then. The fuel cells I'd bled from the ardent were down to a margin I counted in hours, and there came a night when the cold outside the wreck dropped to a number I won't write because no one would believe it, and I understood, lying in the dark with my breath freezing on the bulkhead, that the math had finally finished with me. I had survived the crash, and the cull, and the long climb down into that basin, only to be filed away quietly by the weather, the way the weather files everything on a world like that. I did the foolish thing again. I left the wreck. I don't fully know why, except that a man does not always choose to die in a box if there is open sky to do it under, and I had some half-formed idea of reaching the basin and the warmth of the vents one last time. The whiteout took me 100 meters from the hull. The snow came sideways and the world went to a roaring gray nothing. No up, no down, no ridge, no wreck. Just the cold reaching into my chest to take the last of me. I went down in it. I remember thinking of Soren and of Mara's hands on the engines, and I remember being almost glad, the dull animal gladness of a body that has finished fighting. Then the ground shook and the heat came. They had come out into the whiteout after me. 40 grieving giants, who had every reason to let the strange, soft thing die in the snow, had read the cold the way they read the sky and come out into it to find me. They made a wall of their bodies against the wind and brought me into the middle of it, into a heat like the inside of an engine, and a young one with a notch torn in the leading edge of one wing lay down and curled its whole long body around me the way you'd warm a hatchling. I lived because of that. I lay against that young Vesh's flank through the worst of the dark with its heart booming slow and enormous against my back, and I named it Notch in my head, because a man names the things that keep him alive, and in the morning the storm was gone and I was not. After that I was theirs and they were mine, in whatever crooked way such a thing can be true between a man and a creature that could swallow him. I earned my place the only way I knew how, with my hands. I gave them what the wreck had to give. I cut frozen carcasses small with the salvage cutter so the weakest could feed. When a young female took a fall off the high ice and laid her wing open to the bone, I cleaned it and bound it with strips of the Ardent's insulation and held it shut while she screamed and Vesh stood over us both and did not interfere, which was its own kind of trust. They gave me heat and they gave me the watch, taking turns through the long nights so the human would not freeze. And they gave me slowly the whole map of their grief, every cold nesting ground, every scorch site, every place the Pale had ever been. The nights were longer than anything I had words for, and in them I learned to read the Vesh, or to think I did. They did not sleep all at once. Some always stood, throats banked low, watching the sky out of an old fear, and on the worst nights Vesh herself stood, the white matriarch, motionless for hours over the one egg she still had. I took to standing with her. We did not need to understand each other to share a watch. I learned that their grief was not the wild thing I'd taken it for that first day. It was patient. It was carried. They had been carrying it longer than my whole species had been leaving its own world, season after season of taken children, and they had not gone mad and they had not gone cruel. They had simply endured with a dignity I have never seen matched, and that endurance was the thing that broke my heart and then slowly set it on fire. It was at one of those scorch sites that I learned the killing song up close, and it cost a life to learn it. Midwinter, a small tithe, the Pale came down on a ridge 2 valleys over, and a knot of younger Vesh, too raw to lie flat, broke and charged the lattice before the elders could stop them. I was close enough to see it. I saw the air around that pale lattice light white, and I saw a Vesh I knew, one who had stood the watch over me a dozen nights, fall out of the sky already dead, and I lay in the snow and could do nothing but watch it happen the way they had watched it happen for generations. When the Pale lifted off, I went down to the lattice in the smoke, against every shred of sense, and I dragged the thing out of the bloody snow on a sledge of wrecked panel and hauled it back over 2 ridges in the dark with my arms shaking, because I had understood something in that white flash. The thing killed on a frequency. It was not magic and it was not invincible. It was a machine, and machines can be fouled, and a man who has nothing left to lose has all winter to take a machine apart. Notch became my shadow after that. Where I went, the young one with the torn wing went, watching my hands with those great amber eyes as I worked the wreck. It was Notch, in the end, who showed me the way through. I had been throwing chunks of frozen meat for the young to practice their fire on close work, the way they had always done it, and one afternoon out of some impatience I threw a chunk far, much farther than they ever bothered, halfway across the basin floor, and I watched Notch coil back and spit, and the fire crossed that whole distance in a hard, bright arc and took the meat clean, farther than fire had any right to go. I stood there in the cold with my breath caught, because I had just seen the one thing the Pale's perfect arithmetic had never had to account for, and from that single throw the whole plan began to unspool in my head, charge by charge, second by second, all the way to a burning basin and an empty sky. That was the winter that made the plan. Not a clever flash, not a single moment, but a slow grinding accumulation of small understood things, paid for in cold and in a friend who fell out of the sky, assembled over months in a dead ship's hold by a man the math had already given up on. I should have stayed flat. The smart play, the live another day play, was to watch the Pale take their tithe and leave, and then go on surviving in my sealed compartment until my beacon got an answer or my luck ran out. I had no stake in this. They weren't my people. The eggs weren't my children. A reasonable man minds his own dying. But I had watched Vesh stand her vigil over that one last egg, silent, out of strength to weep, and I knew that come the next tithe the Pale would take that egg too. They would take the last thing she had, and they would feel about it what they felt about soil, and she would learn one more time that there was nothing to be done. And every cell in me that the crash and the cold had left intact rose up against that and said no, not because I could win. I had no earthly reason to believe I could win. Just no. The plain animal no of a creature that has had enough taken from it and decides, against all sense, to make the next taking cost something. That's the part the Pale's model didn't have a column for. I figured that out slowly, over the dark weeks, turning it like a stone in my hand. The Pale were perfect at what they did because what they did had never once been resisted in a way that mattered. Their whole method ran on the assumption that nothing on that field would ever fight back, because fighting back was suicide and living things, sensible living things, choose to live. Their efficiency was total and it had made them brittle. They did not adapt because they had never needed to. They had no defense against a thing that would spend itself entirely, because in all their long arithmetic of yield and cost, they had never met grief willing to die. I had two things to work with. I had a wrecked ship full of the most dangerous substances men make, and I had 40 grieving giants who could throw fire. I'd learned about the fire by accident. Early on, half-starved, I'd watched a young vesh crack open the frozen carcass of something to feed. It reared back and spat, and the spit hit the carcass and the air around it bloomed into flame, a hard white-orange burst that didn't need a spark. Two glands I worked out later, two fluids harmless apart and hypergolic together, mixed in the throat and thrown. They used it to crack ice and thaw prey and warm the nests. Short range, a few meters, but ferocious, hot enough to flash-boil flesh. It was a tool to them, a gentle domestic thing. They had never once thought to throw it at the pail, because the pail never came within a few meters. And what good is a fire you can only set at arm's length against an enemy that kills you from 100 meters out? That was the puzzle, get the fire to the enemy. And the answer was in the wreck of the Ardent, in the reactor's coolant lines and the fuel bunkerage and the mag rifle sarin kept for bad ports, and in the one thing the Pale's perfect schedule made certain. That on tithe day, the landers would come down, and the Pale would pour out onto the ground, and for a few hours the harvest would happen at close range, on the surface, in the open, because that was the only way to gather soft biomass that couldn't be reached from orbit. The thing that made them deadly distance, they gave up the moment they came to feed. They had to. You cannot strip a field from the sky. So I would make the ground theirs to die on. It took the rest of the winter and most of what I was. I worked the wreck in the cold until my hands stopped being hands and became tools, swollen and slow. I drained the Ardent's fuel into every container I could seal, hundreds of liters of the stuff, and I cut the coolant lines and bled off the volatile compounds, and I learned through trial and a burned forearm which of them the Vesh fire would set and which it wouldn't. I built fuel charges, simple things, ruptured drums rigged so a thrown gout of dragonfire would breach and ignite them. The lattice piece I dragged home that midwinter, I took apart with the cutter over 100 patient hours until I understood that it sang on a frequency and that the singing was what killed, and that if I could foul the frequency I could blind it for a few seconds. I could not break it. I could make it stutter. A few seconds. That was the whole margin I had to work with, and I built the entire plan inside it. The Vesh learned faster than men would have. I'll say that plainly. Once Vesh understood what I was reaching for, once the matriarch grasped that the human in the snow was not asking them to die uselessly against the lattice, but to do one specific thing at one specific moment, the whole clan turned to it. I could not speak to them, not really, but we found a language of gesture and fire and patience. I showed them the fuel charges. I showed them where to lay the fire. I walked the basin 100 times marking the lines, where the landers always set down, where the Pale always swept first, where a body my size could lie in the snow and not be a line item until it was too late. The young ones practiced throwing fire at distance, farther than they ever had, because grief makes you strong and a purpose makes you precise. We rehearsed dying, that's the truth of it. There was no version of the plan where the whole pack walked away. The lattice would kill some of them in the first seconds before I could foul it. The Pale would not go quietly. I made them understand the cost as best I could, and not one of them flinched from it, and I have thought about that every day since. Men talk themselves into and out of courage. The Vesh simply weighed the loss they were carrying against the loss they were willing to take, and chose, and never spoke of it again. I have never in my life been in better company. The tithe came on a gray morning with snow falling in fat, slow flakes. The pack went silent and low the way they always did, and this time the silence had something else under it, a held breath, a coil. Vesh found me where I lay among the fuel charges with the fouling rig wired to my body and the mag rifle across my arms, and she lowered that great white head and breathed once over me, hot as a furnace, the same as the day we met. I put my ruined hand against her jaw. Then the Landers fell out of the cloud, silent, bone-white, 3 of them, settling onto the basin floor exactly where they always settled, and the pail poured out in their perfect grid lines and began to take the world. I let them get deep into it. That was the hardest hour of my life, lying in the snow watching those pale-jointed things lift the last eggs out of the warm scrapes, watching the cradles fill, doing nothing, because the plan needed them committed, needed them spread out and busy and far from the safety of the Landers, with the lattice humming its killing song over the whole basin. I watched a forager reach into Vesh's nest and lift out her last egg, the one she'd stood over all winter, and stow it in a white cradle, and I felt her go rigid across the basin, and I prayed she would hold, and she held. She held. That was the most human thing I ever saw a creature do that wasn't a man. Then the foragers turned back toward the Landers with the harvest, and that was the moment, and I keyed the fouling rig. The lattice's song broke into a stutter. I felt it more than heard it, a wrongness in the air, a few seconds where the white death stopped being certain. And into those few seconds the whole Ridge clan rose up out of the snow as one, 40 grieving giants who had spent a winter learning to throw fire farther than fire had ever been thrown, and they let go. I have seen ordnance, I served. I have seen a city's defense grid light a sky. I have never seen anything like the Vesh that morning. The fire came down on the pail in long arcs white-orange, and where it struck the fuel charges I'd laid, the whole basin floor went up in a sheet of flame that climbed the falling snow. The pail's perfect grid dissolved. They had no protocol for this. They had never needed one. They moved to reform, to fall back to the Landers and the lattice's protection, and they found the ground between them and the Landers was a wall of burning fuel, and the air above it was full of fire coming down, and the thing that had made them invincible, their distance, was gone, because they were standing in the middle of the field they'd come to reap, and the field had risen up. The lattice came back. Of course it did. My fouling rig burned out in the first 30 seconds and the killing song steadied and the white light bloomed and 3 of the Vesh fell out of the air smoking, and then a 4th, and the cost I'd warned them of came due in front of me. But 30 seconds against the pail was an eternity they had never had to survive, and in 30 seconds the Vesh had turned the basin into a furnace and stranded the foragers on the wrong side of it, and the Landers were the thing. The Landers held the cradles and the harvest, and were now ringed in fire with their crews cut off. I went for the nearest Lander myself. That had always been my part. The Vesh could not get inside the things, but a man could, a small soft thing the pail's grid hadn't bothered to count, low and crawling through the smoke with a mag rifle and a satchel of the worst chemistry the Arden had to offer. I won't dress it up. It was close work and it was ugly, and the pail, for all that they felt nothing, did not die easily. I emptied the rifle. I used the cutter. I lost the use of my left hand for good somewhere in there and didn't notice until after. I got into the Lander's belly where the cradles were stacked, and I set the satchel and I got the cradles, as many as I could carry, the warm ones, the living ones, and I went back out through the smoke with eggs cradled against my chest like the last of everything. The satchel did its work behind me. The Lander came apart in a gout of white fire, and the second Lander, ringed in the Vesh's flame, never lifted, and the third clawed up into the cloud half-crippled and fled and did not come back. The foragers on the wrong side of the fire the Vesh took apart one by one, methodically, the way they had been taken apart, season after season, and I did not look away from it, and I do not apologize for it. When it was over, the basin was burning and the snow was black and the sky was empty, and I was on my knees in the ash with eggs against my chest, and Vesh came to me through the smoke. She was burned down one side, the old scar matched now by a new one, but she was alive, and when she saw what I held she made a sound I had never heard, low, 2 notes rising, the inverse of the falling notes she'd made the day we met. I put the cradles down in front of her and I opened them, and the eggs were warm and whole, 11 of them. 11 out of 61. And I knew the number then and I know it now. And 11 is not enough. 11 will never be enough, but 11 is not nothing. And the Vesh had not nothing in longer than I had been alive. We lost 9 of the pack that morning. 9 giants who had decided that the loss they carried weighed more than the loss they would take. I helped build the cairns, what passed for cairns, and the Vesh keened over them. And this time I keened with them, in my cracked human voice, and they let me, and that is the closest I have ever come to belonging anywhere. Pale did not come back. Not that season, not the next. Whether the third lander carried the word home, whether somewhere in their long arithmetic a column finally appeared that said this field fights back and the yield is no longer worth the cost, I will never know. I like to think they recalculated. I like to think that on some white world I'll never see, a thing that feels nothing looked at the numbers from that moon and quietly struck it from the harvest, not out of mercy, never mercy, just cost. We had made the Vesh expensive. That was the whole victory. We did not beat the Pale. You don't beat a thing like the Pale. We just made ourselves cost more than we were worth, and for a creature that only counts cost, that is the only language there is. My beacon got an answer the following spring. A survey ship, drawn by the wreck signal, astonished to find a man alive. They offered to take me off, back to the worlds, back to a life. I stood at the bottom of the ramp a long time with the cold wind at my back and the 11 hatchlings calling from the basin, grown now, clumsy and loud and alive, and Vesh watching me from the ridge with her amber eye, and I knew I had a choice and I knew I had already made it. I told them to log the moon as dead. I told them the survey had it right. Then I walked back up the basin into the snow, and the survey ship left without me, and I have never once regretted it. I am an old man now by my reckoning, though the Vesh do not measure years the way I do, and to them I am simply the human who came in the snow. The hatchlings I carried out of the lander have hatchlings of their own. Vesh is gone these many seasons, the way the old go, quiet with her clan around her, and I stood my vigil over her the way she stood hers over that last egg, silent at the end, out of strength to weep. The new matriarch was one of the 11. She lets me put my old ruined hand against her jaw. The sky is empty. It has been empty a long time. People ask me, the rare times anyone reaches that place and finds me, why I stayed. They expect something noble. They want a man to say he found a higher cause among the stars. The truth is smaller and harder than that. I stayed because I had buried my own and had nothing left to bury them with but a moon that wasn't mine, and a grief that wasn't mine, and a fight that was never mine until I made it mine. I stayed because the Pale taught me what it looks like to stand over a loss and feel nothing, and I would rather die among creatures who keen than live among anyone who counts. I stayed because somebody has to remember the empty nests, and somebody has to be there when the sky tries to come down again, and old men with ruined hands are good for that if they are good for nothing else. They told me the moon was dead. They were wrong about that, and I have spent a lifetime making sure it stays wrong. The snow still falls in fat, slow flakes some mornings, the way it did on the day of the tithe, and when it does the whole clan goes quiet and low out of an old memory in their bodies, and I go quiet with them, and we watch the sky together, the dragons and the one strange creature who came down out of it broken and chose to stay. The sky stays empty. We keep it that way. And that is enough on the cold mornings. That is enough.